Hi, welcome back. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we're going to talk about the smartest man in the universe, and what that actually costs. Before we go any further, if this kind of content helps you wind down and drift off, subscribing is completely free, and it means you won't miss the next one. No pressure, you're already here, and that's enough. Now close your eyes if you want to, or don't. Either way, let's talk about Rick Sanchez. Rick Sanchez is a 70-year-old alcoholic with a portal gun who lives in his daughter's garage. He has invented faster-than-light travel, built sentient life from scratch, outsmarted gods and governments and the heat death of the universe. He can do anything. He has done almost everything. And he spends his Sunday afternoons watching television and drinking something brown out of a flask that never seems to run out. This is the premise of Rick and Morty, and on the surface it looks like a show about a genius and his grandson going on wild adventures across infinite dimensions. Aliens, robots, interdimensional cable, a miniature amusement park inside a human body. The comedy is fast, the sci-fi is sharp, and the whole thing is wrapped in enough irony to feel safely detached from any real emotion. But the show keeps doing something that the comedy almost hides. It keeps asking, with genuine seriousness, what happens to a person who actually knows everything? What is the inner life of someone who has seen every possible version of reality, run every calculation, survived every catastrophe, and emerged on the other side with no illusions left? What do you do when you are so far past the point of being surprised that wonder itself has become inaccessible? These are not new questions. Philosophers have been asking versions of them for a long time. But Rick Sanchez asks them with a flask in one hand and a portal gun in the other, in between belches, in a cartoon on Adult Swim, and somehow that makes them land harder than they would in a lecture hall. So settle in, we have time. These ideas are worth sitting with slowly. Hi, welcome back. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we're going to talk about the smartest man in the universe, and what that actually costs. Before we go any further, if this kind of content helps you wind down and drift off, subscribing is completely free, and it means you won't miss the next one. No pressure, you're already here, and that's enough. Now close your eyes if you want to, or don't. Either way, let's talk about Rick Sanchez. Rick Sanchez is a 70-year-old alcoholic with a portal gun who lives in his daughter's garage. He has invented faster-than-light travel, built sentient life from scratch, outsmarted gods and governments and the heat death of the universe. He can do anything. He has done almost everything. And he spends his Sunday afternoons watching television and drinking something brown out of a flask that never seems to run out. This is the premise of Rick and Morty, and on the surface it looks like a show about a genius and his grandson going on wild adventures across infinite dimensions. Aliens, robots, interdimensional cable, a miniature amusement park inside a human body. The comedy is fast, the sci-fi is sharp, and the whole thing is wrapped in enough irony to feel safely detached from any real emotion. But the show keeps doing something that the comedy almost hides. It keeps asking, with genuine seriousness, what happens to a person who actually knows everything? What is the inner life of someone who has seen every possible version of reality, run every calculation, survived every catastrophe, and emerged on the other side with no illusions left? What do you do when you are so far past the point of being surprised that wonder itself has become inaccessible? These are not new questions. Philosophers have been asking versions of them for a long time. But Rick Sanchez asks them with a flask in one hand and a portal gun in the other, in between belches, in a cartoon on Adult Swim, and somehow that makes them land harder than they would in a lecture hall. So settle in, we have time. These ideas are worth sitting with slowly. The man who knows too much. Start with what Rick actually is, stripped of the comedy. Rick is a man who has lived with complete knowledge of how reality works for so long that the knowledge has become a kind of burden he can't put down. He knows there are infinite universes. He knows that in most of them, he exists in some form, and that the choices he makes here are simply the choices he makes in this branch of the multiverse. Not because they're right, not because they matter in any cosmic sense, but because they're the choices that happened. He knows that meaning, if it exists at all, is something humans construct rather than discover. He knows the universe is indifferent. He knows consciousness is probably an accident. He has met gods and found them bureaucratic and irritating. He has encountered beings of pure intelligence and found them dull. He has looked at the full scope of existence and come away with the sense that it is, in his words, a Rick and Morty thing. And then he goes home and drinks. There is a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer who would have understood Rick immediately. Schopenhauer was a German thinker who lived from 1788 to 1860. He is not the most cheerful philosopher in the tradition. He wrote a book called The World as Will and Representation, and the central argument of that book is that reality is driven by a force he called the will, a blind, purposeless, relentless striving that has no goal and no destination. It is energy-seeking expression with no reason to seek anything. Schopenhauer believed that the more intelligent a person is, the more clearly they can perceive this underlying meaninglessness. The more clearly they perceive it, the more they suffer. Because intelligence doesn't give you tools for coping with the void, it just makes the void more visible. This is called the pessimism problem, and it is Rick's problem, rendered in animation. Rick's intelligence is not his salvation, it is the source of his pain. He can see what other people can't see, the machinery behind the curtain, the cold arithmetic of a universe that has no investment in anyone's happiness, and he cannot unsee it. He cannot go back to being the kind of person who finds comfort in ordinary things, because ordinary things reveal their construction when you look too closely, and Rick always looks too closely. This is why he drinks, not because he is weak, because he is, in a way that the show takes seriously, trapped. Nidus asterisk asterisk, the question of nihilism asterisk asterisk asterisk. Let's slow down here, because there's a word that gets attached to Rick all the time, usually by people who use it loosely. Nihilism. Rick is described as a nihilist constantly, by fans, by critics, by the show itself, sometimes, and there's something true in that description. Rick does seem to believe that nothing matters, that the universe has no inherent meaning, that the moral frameworks humans use to organize their lives are, as he once put it, arbitrary constraints imposed by the dominant culture. But calling Rick a nihilist and stopping there misses something important, because there's a distinction in philosophy between different kinds of nihilism, and Rick sits in a complicated place between them. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who is most associated with nihilism, even though his relationship to it was much more complicated than most people realize, made a distinction between passive nihilism and active nihilism. Passive nihilism is what happens when you recognize that the old values have collapsed and then stop there. You've destroyed the foundation and you don't build anything new. You drift, you numb yourself, you give up without quite admitting you've given up. Active nihilism is different. It is the recognition that the old values are gone, followed by the will to create new ones. It is destruction as a clearing, making space for something to be built from scratch, even if that something is entirely personal and entirely invented. Nietzsche called the person capable of this the Übermensch, which translates roughly as the overman or the superman, someone who doesn't need God or fate or tradition to give life meaning, someone who creates meaning through will, through commitment, through the act of choosing what matters. Rick is on the surface a passive nihilist. He drinks, he drifts, he destroys things and rarely builds anything lasting. He has, across multiple seasons, essentially told Morty and the audience that nothing matters, that all their adventures are ultimately meaningless in the scope of infinite time and infinite universes. But the show keeps complicating this portrait, and the complication is this: Rick keeps coming back. He keeps going on adventures. He keeps saving Morty, often at enormous cost to himself. He has, in moments the comedy tries to pass over quickly, shown that he cares about Morty, about Beth, about a few other people who have gotten close enough to matter. The man who says nothing matters keeps acting as if some things do. This is not inconsistency. This is the actual tension at the heart of his character. Rick knows, intellectually, that meaning is constructed. He knows that the reasons he loves the people he loves are not cosmic or ordained, they are just chemical and biographical and contingent. But knowing that doesn't stop him from loving them. And this gap, between what he knows and how he acts, is where the philosophy lives. Morty's function. Before we go deeper into Rick, we need to talk about Morty, because you can't understand the philosophy of Rick without understanding what Morty is to him. Morty Smith is 14 years old. He is, by his own and everyone else's assessment, average. He struggles in school. He has normal anxieties about normal things: girls, popularity, his family's dysfunction. He is not exceptional in any measurable way. And Rick, the smartest person in the universe, chooses to spend his time with him. There is a practical reason the show gives for this. Rick explains in an early episode that Morty's brainwave frequency is the perfect camouflage for Rick's genius-level brainwaves. When they travel together, interdimensional authorities have a harder time tracking Rick. Morty is, in this framing, a human cloaking device, but no one who watches the show seriously believes that's the whole story. Morty functions for Rick the way that concrete reality functions for a philosopher who has gone too abstract. He is a tether. He pulls Rick back into the particulars, this adventure, this problem, this frightened 14-year-old who is currently being chased by something enormous and needs Rick to stop philosophizing and open a portal. There is a tradition in philosophy associated with the existentialists, and particularly with the philosopher Martin Heidegger, that argues human beings are always already embedded in the world before we ever start thinking about it. We are thrown into existence, into specific bodies, specific families, specific historical moments, and our thinking always happens from inside that thrown situation. We are not observers who stand outside the world and look at it. We are participants, always already caught up in things, already in the middle of something. Rick, in his genius and his isolation, has tried to become an observer. He has tried to get far enough outside the human situation to see it clearly and completely, and in doing so, he has lost the embeddedness that makes life feel real. He can calculate everything, he can feel almost nothing. Morty puts him back inside things. An adventure with Morty is not an abstract thought experiment. It is something that is happening to Morty right now, and Morty is scared, and Rick is the only person who can help. You cannot be detached when someone is scared and depending on you. The dependence overrides the detachment. This is not a small thing. This is possibly the most important thing about Rick. He has, through Morty, found a way to remain human despite knowing everything that should make humanity seem small. The Szechuan sauce and the collapse of self-deception. There's an episode in season 3 called The Rick Redemption that has a scene everyone talked about for the wrong reasons. Rick, trapped inside a memory simulation used by interdimensional government agents trying to extract his portal fluid formula, constructs an elaborate false memory to deceive his captors. The false memory involves a young Rick watching his wife and daughter be killed by another Rick who drops a bomb through a portal. In this memory, young Rick refuses to build a portal gun in revenge. He chooses his family over power. The agents believe this is the emotional core of Rick's character, the wound that made him who he is. They use it to construct what they think is a genuine psychological profile. Then Rick reveals that he made the whole thing up. Or did he? The show doesn't confirm either way. We never learn whether that memory is real. Rick claims it isn't, but Rick lies constantly, most of all to himself. And the emotion he performs during the memory's construction is almost too convincing for someone who is simply manufacturing a fiction. At the end of that same episode, Rick tells Morty that his entire escape plan, all the scheming and manipulation, was motivated by getting McDonald's Szechuan dipping sauce, a promotional condiment from 1998 that he remembers from childhood. He delivers this revelation with the grandiosity of a man announcing his ultimate purpose. It's played as a joke, the audience laughed, the internet went insane, but try reading it straight. Rick has just escaped from the most powerful law enforcement body in the universe. He has outmaneuvered alien intelligences. He has reasserted his position at the center of his family's life. He could have any motivation in the universe for doing all of that, and the motivation he claims, the thing he says was driving him the whole time, is a condiment he ate when he was a child. That is not a joke about Szechuan sauce. That is Rick telling you that the reasons he does things are arbitrary, that the big machinery of his genius serves whatever small appetite happens to be running in the background, that there is no grand plan, no ultimate goal, no meaning behind the motion. And the horror of that, dressed up as comedy so we don't have to feel it too directly, is the horror of the philosophy Rick embodies. The Schopenhauer problem, continued. Let's come back to Schopenhauer, because he takes us somewhere Rick takes us to. Schopenhauer believed that the only honest response to the will, to the blind striving that drives all of existence, was either asceticism or aesthetic experience. Asceticism means withdrawing from desire entirely, starving the will of the fuel it runs on. Aesthetic experience, particularly music, means temporarily losing yourself in something that the will can't quite reach. Something that feels, for a moment, free of the endless wanting and suffering that otherwise defines existence. Rick uses alcohol and adventure for what Schopenhauer used art. The adventures are not just entertainment. For Rick, they are the only moments when he is not fully conscious of what he knows. When Morty is in danger and Rick has to improvise. When the stakes are immediate and the problem is specific. Rick is temporarily free of the meta-awareness that otherwise tortures him. He can't think about the heat death of the universe when he's trying to not get eaten by a planet-sized spider. This is the same thing athletes call flow. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying states of complete absorption in an activity, moments when a person's skill is perfectly matched to a challenge and self-consciousness disappears. You stop narrating your own experience. You stop evaluating, you just are inside the thing. Rick is too smart for most activities to produce flow. The gap between his ability and the challenge is almost always enormous. He can solve most problems in seconds. But Morty changes the equation, because Morty introduces unpredictability. Rick cannot fully predict what Morty will do, which means Morty keeps the challenge alive in a way that Rick's own plans can't. Morty is the randomness that keeps Rick present. Without Morty, Rick would be entirely alone with what he knows. And what he knows, as the show makes clear in its quieter moments, is almost too much to hold. I don't do magic. There's something that comes up repeatedly in the show that is worth looking at carefully. Rick has a consistent contempt for religion, mysticism, and anything that feels like false comfort. He dismisses prayer. He has met actual gods and found them unimpressive. When characters turn to faith or superstition or intuition, Rick tends to roll his eyes. This is usually read as arrogance. Rick thinks he knows better than everyone, including whatever deities happen to exist. But there's something else under the arrogance. Rick refuses magic, and by magic I mean the kind of thinking that makes things feel more meaningful than the evidence supports, because he understands exactly what it does. Magic is the mind's way of protecting itself from the weight of what is actually true. It wraps the cold facts in something warmer. It gives the randomness a shape. Rick can't do that. He knows how the randomness works. He has seen behind the curtain too many times. Every time he might feel the pull of something comforting, the idea that the universe has a plan, that things happen for reasons, that love is more than chemistry, that consciousness is more than neurons firing, he immediately sees the machinery underneath, and the machinery is mundane and relentless and doesn't care. Rick creates a love potion for Morty at Morty's request. The potion goes wrong. Then the antidote goes wrong. Then the second antidote goes worse than wrong. By the end, the Earth is populated almost entirely by creatures called Cronenbergs, human bodies mutated into something monstrous, horrifying, irreversible. Rick can't fix it. This is the fact the show sits with. The smartest man in the universe, with unlimited resources and a portal gun, cannot undo what he has done to his world. So he does the only thing he can. He finds a parallel Earth where Rick and Morty died in an explosion just after solving the same problem. He and Morty take those dead versions places. They bury their own bodies. They walk back into their house, and they resume their lives. Morty is devastated. He tells Summer, his sister, that this is why Rick needs him, because Morty has seen that nothing matters, and now he's ruined. Now he's like Rick, and Rick lets Morty believe this. He doesn't correct him, but what actually happened in that episode is more complicated than Morty's interpretation. Rick chose continuity. Rick chose the specific family, the specific relationships, the specific version of the life he had. When faced with the permanent loss of everything he knew, he did not shrug and find another dimension to colonize. He found the closest possible thing to what he had lost, and fought to preserve it. This is not the behavior of a man who truly believes nothing matters. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career thinking about personal identity, about what makes you the same person across time, and about what it means for you to continue to exist. Parfit was unusual among philosophers because his conclusions were, in a strange way, liberating. He argued that the sharp, bounded self we think we have, the clear line between me and not me, now and then, is somewhat illusory. We are more continuous with others, and more fragmented over time, than we usually feel. Rick intuitively operates on this understanding. He doesn't mourn the Rick he was yesterday, doesn't cling to a fixed self-image, doesn't need his history to be intact to know who he is. He can slip into a parallel life, and continue as if nothing happened, but he doesn't slip into just any life. He picks the closest one. He finds the version that preserves the specific people he loves. That specificity matters. It is evidence that the relationships, while not metaphysically necessary, are genuinely chosen. The grandfather and the wound. Somewhere underneath all of this is a question the show circles but only partially answers. What happened to Rick? The false memory in the Rick Redemption. Rick's wife and daughter killed by a bomb dropped by another Rick. Young Rick choosing family over science. May be invented, but inventions reveal something about the person who makes them up. You construct the memory that would explain the self you've become. The fact that Rick's constructed backstory involves the destruction of his family and a refusal to pursue power suggests something about what he actually lost and what he actually regrets. The show's 4th and 5th seasons give us more. We learn more about Rick Prime, the Rick who did drop that bomb, who did kill Rick's family, who is the original cause of everything Rick became. We learn that Rick spent decades trying to find Rick Prime, and that the vengeance that consumed him is the thing that drove the development of all his technology, all his power. He became the most powerful man in the universe in pursuit of revenge. And when the revenge was finally within reach, it turned out to be empty. Not because revenge is always empty, that's too easy a moral, but because the thing Rick actually wanted, his wife back, the life he had before, was not retrievable. The revenge was a substitute goal, something achievable in place of something that wasn't, and achieving the substitute doesn't fill the space the original loss left. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the aesthetic stage of existence, a mode of life organized around experience, sensation, novelty. The aesthetic person chases stimulation because stimulation keeps the inner emptiness at bay, but the stimulation always fades. The next experience is always required. There is no satisfaction that lasts. Rick is, in his adventures, in his alcohol, in his constant motion across infinite universes, an aesthetic personality in Kierkegaard's sense. He is running from the thing he can't get back. He is filling the space his family's absence left with enough chaos and movement that he doesn't have to be still with it. Morty is, again, the complication, because Morty is also family. A grandson, not a wife or a daughter, but family. Someone small and dependent and specific who calls him Rick in the particular way that only this Morty does. Someone who, despite everything, needs him. Rick doesn't know how to need anyone anymore, but he knows how to be needed. And for now, that's holding the whole thing together. The loneliness of knowing. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no good name in common speech. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. Rick is rarely physically alone. He is surrounded by his family, by his adventures, by the noise and color of infinite dimensions. It's the loneliness of a mind that has no peers. Not because the person is arrogant and refuses to acknowledge others, though Rick is arrogant, genuinely and extravagantly, but because the distance between what they can perceive and what the people around them can perceive is too great to be bridged by ordinary conversation. Rick cannot tell Morty what he actually knows. He cannot explain what it is like to have traveled through 500 universes and come back to this one specifically because this one has this version of Morty. He cannot describe the texture of existing in full awareness of your own contingency, the fact that you are not necessary, not special in any cosmic sense, just the version of yourself that happened to survive long enough to get old. He cannot talk about this because words move through people and land somewhere, and the somewhere they land in Rick's family is not the place they start. The gap is too wide, and so Rick talks in other ways, in inventions, in rescues, in the particular kind of gruff affection that shows up as "You're my greatest adventure, Morty, and I love you," delivered in a belch, and immediately undercut with something crass. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, famously, that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. He meant that we can only think clearly about things we have language for. Beyond language, there is only experience without structure, feeling without form. Rick is beyond language in the most literal possible sense. He knows things that have no words in any human tongue. He has experienced things that the human nervous system was not built to process without medication. And so he is always, in some sense, alone, not abandoned, not isolated, but fundamentally unable to be fully known. Morty is the closest anyone has come, not because Morty understands Rick. Morty explicitly doesn't, but because Morty is present. Morty shows up. Morty goes through things with Rick that no one else has gone through, and even if Morty can't fully process what those things mean, the shared experience builds something, not understanding, something else. something that might, over time, outlast the adventures. The question of happiness. At the end of season 2, Rick turns himself in to the Galactic Federation to save his family. He is imprisoned. He tells Morty, before surrendering, that he did it for him, for Morty specifically, not for the abstract principle of family or duty, but for this specific 14-year-old in front of him. He is taken away. The credits roll over a Rick sitting alone in a cell in space, drunk, staring at nothing. If you ask whether Rick is happy, the honest answer is no. Rick Sanchez is not happy. He may not have been happy for a very long time, possibly since before the events the show has shown us. But this is where the philosophy gets complicated in an interesting direction, because happiness, the kind we usually mean when we say the word, requires a certain degree of not seeing clearly. The philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote about higher and lower pleasures, and he argued that a person who has tasted the higher pleasures can never be fully satisfied by the lower ones. But he also made a famous claim that is more ambivalent than it sounds, that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill is on Rick's side here. Rick's suffering comes from his capacity, his intelligence, his access to the full truth of how things are. The fool who doesn't know these things and is content in not knowing. Mill would say that contentment is lesser, that the Socratic dissatisfaction contains something more valuable. But the show, like the Simpsons episode that explored the same territory through Homer's crayon, refuses to endorse this position cleanly. Because we watch Rick, we watch him for multiple seasons, and the suffering is not ennobling, the suffering is just suffering. It does not produce wisdom that Rick can share. It does not make him kinder or clearer or more capable of love. It makes him drink more. It makes him meaner. It makes him desperate in ways he won't acknowledge, taking risks that would only make sense if some part of him doesn't actually care whether he lives. The philosophy the show seems to be building toward, not stating explicitly, but building toward, through accumulation of character and story, is something like this. Intelligence without connection destroys. Knowing everything, without someone to know it alongside, is not a gift. It is a kind of sentence, and the antidote is not ignorance. The antidote is Morty. The antidote is Beth, and the conversation at the end of the ABCs of Beth. The antidote is the specific, unrepeatable, contingent love for particular people that cannot be derived from first principles and cannot be replaced by any other relationship in any other universe. Rick doesn't fully believe this. He resists it constantly. He would probably argue against it with 20 different philosophical frameworks if you gave him a quiet moment and a whiteboard, but he keeps coming back to the garage. He keeps taking Morty on adventures. He keeps saving the people he loves at costs that only make sense if those people are to him worth any cost. The show doesn't resolve this. It just keeps showing us both things. The man who knows that love is chemistry, and the man who acts as if it isn't, and lets them coexist in the same character, in the same house, in the same flask-shaped absence of peace. The man who has already died. There's something the show establishes early, and then leaves sitting in the background of almost everything that happens. Rick has died before, many times probably. The mechanics of the multiverse mean that when one version of Rick fails, another can take his place. The Rick we follow may not be the original Rick. He may be the 5th or the 50th, stepping into the role after some prior version was destroyed in an adventure the show never showed us. Rick knows this. He lives with the knowledge that his own continuity is not guaranteed, that the self he identifies with is one configuration among infinite possible configurations, that death, for him specifically, is not the wall it is for everyone else. You might expect this to be liberating. If death is not permanent for you, then you are free from the fear that constrains most human decision-making. You can take risks that others can't take. You can afford to be reckless in ways that would be suicidal for anyone without a backup. But the show suggests something more complicated, and the philosopher Martin Heidegger provides the language for it. Heidegger argued that what makes human life meaningful, what makes choices feel weighty, relationships feel precious, time feel worth spending carefully, is precisely the fact that death is final. He called this being toward death, the awareness that you are moving toward an end, that time is finite, that this specific configuration of relationships and memories and capabilities will not exist forever. This awareness, Heidegger argued, is not a source of despair. It is a source of authenticity. It forces you to choose, because you cannot have everything, because not choosing is itself a choice, because the clock is running. Rick has disrupted this completely. When death is not quite final, when the self is not quite singular, when the backup version is always available, the urgency collapses, the weight that makes choices feel real disappears. You can always try again. You can always find another branch of the multiverse where things went differently. This is why Rick is, despite everything, rootless. He cannot fully commit to anything because commitment requires the acceptance that you are giving up other possibilities permanently. Rick has not given up other possibilities permanently. He has kept every door open, and the person who keeps every door open ends up standing in the hallway forever, going nowhere. Morty does not have this problem. Morty's life is singular. His choices accumulate. He cannot step sideways into a parallel Morty who chose differently. What he does is what he did, and he lives with it. This is part of why Rick needs Morty in ways he would never admit. Morty experiences time the way time is supposed to be experienced, as something irreversible, as something that matters, as something that makes the present moment count. When Rick is with Morty, he borrows some of that singularity. The adventure they are on is the adventure they are on, not one of infinite possible adventures. The Morty next to him is this Morty, not a stand-in for all possible Mortys. The stakes, filtered through Morty's experience of them, become real. This is the philosophical gift that the least intelligent person in the room gives to the most intelligent. Mortality returned, meaning restored. The weight that genius had subtracted from existence, given back by someone who never lost it in the first place. What Rick teaches us about being alive. It is almost morning in Springfield, and Rick is asleep in the garage. The portal gun is on the workbench. The flask is half empty or half full, depending on who you ask. Morty is upstairs, probably dreaming about something ordinary. Rick Sanchez is not a role model. He is not a blueprint for how to live. He is in many ways a cautionary portrait. What happens when capability becomes untethered from tenderness? When intelligence runs so far ahead of wisdom that wisdom can't catch up? But here is what he is also. He is honest about the void in a way that most characters, most people, most stories refuse to be. He doesn't dress it up. He doesn't paper over the absence of inherent meaning with comfortable fictions. He sits in the garage with it, drinking, and he keeps going anyway. That keeping going, that refusal to stop, even in the absence of a good reason to continue, even when the reasons he invents are arbitrary and his own, that is something real. It is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is not virtue in Aristotle's sense. It is closer to what Albert Camus described when he imagined Sisyphus happy. The act of continuing, of pushing the boulder, not because the boulder needs to be at the top of the hill, but because the pushing is what Sisyphus does, and doing it is the only form of defiance available. Rick defies. He defies the meaninglessness he perceives by continuing to find specific people worth saving. He defies his own philosophy every time he chooses Morty over pure detachment. He is, despite everything he knows and everything he says, still in the game, still showing up, still opening portals, still stumbling back into the house and sitting down at the kitchen table with a family that is not perfect and is not permanent and is, for reasons he cannot fully articulate, worth every universe he has burned through to get back to. The lessons here are not comfortable ones. They don't resolve into a tidy list of philosophical takeaways, but they are worth sitting with as you drift off tonight. That knowing the truth about something doesn't automatically make the living of it easier. That intelligence is a tool, not a destination. That the specific people you love, not people in general, not humanity as an abstract concept, but the specific, flawed, irreplaceable individuals who know your name, are not a consolation prize for failing to transcend the human condition. They are the human condition. They are what makes the whole complicated, exhausting, occasionally magnificent project worth anything at all. Rick knows this. He can't say it. He shows it every time he comes back, and that might be the most human thing about him. The problem of other Ricks. Let the ideas settle for a moment. We're not rushing anywhere. There's a dimension of Rick's existence we haven't spent enough time with yet, and it's one that makes his situation genuinely unlike anything in the history of philosophy. Because philosophers have always had to construct thought experiments when they wanted to explore questions about identity and selfhood. They invented hypotheticals. Imagine a ship where every plank is replaced one by one. Is it still the same ship? Imagine you are teleported, your original body destroyed and an exact copy reassembled elsewhere. Is that copy you? These are useful fictions. They illuminate something real about the puzzle of personal identity. Rick doesn't need hypotheticals. He lives inside them. There are infinite Ricks. The show makes this explicit through the citadel of Ricks, an entire civilization built by Ricks from across the multiverse who banded together for safety and mutual benefit. It is Rick, plural, a government composed entirely of one man in different configurations. And Rick the 100th, 137, our Rick, the Rick the show follows, despises it. He despises it with a specificity that tells you something. The Citadel represents the version of Rick that chose comfort over individuality. Those Ricks decided that what they shared with other Ricks, the intelligence, the loneliness, the history, was more important than what made each of them distinct. They pooled themselves. They became a collective, and our Rick reads this as a betrayal of everything it means to be Rick. The philosopher John Locke, writing in the 17th century, argued that personal identity is constituted by memory. You are the same person across time because you remember being that person, because there is a continuous chain of remembered experience linking who you were to who you are now. When that chain breaks, when memory is lost or disrupted, something essential is lost with it. By this standard, the Ricks of the Citadel are all legitimate Ricks. They all remember being Rick. They all have the same chain. Locke would have no way of distinguishing between them. But Rick does distinguish, and the distinction he draws is not about memory. It's about what you did with what you remember. Our Rick survived things, made choices, lost people, kept going in a particular direction, and that direction, that specific sequence of consequences and responses, is what makes him him. The Citadel Ricks made different choices at their branching points. They arrived at collaboration where he arrived at isolation. They found community where he found contempt for the very idea of community. The philosopher Derek Parfit, who we touched on briefly, spent considerable time arguing that personal identity is less determinate than we feel it to be, and that what we usually think of as the self is more like a series of connected selves across time than a single continuous entity. He thought this was liberating. If the self is not a rigid, bounded thing, then the fear of death is somewhat irrational. The person who dies tomorrow is not quite the same person who goes to sleep tonight, and the loss is not the total annihilation it feels like. Rick, surrounded by infinite versions of himself, is living the most extreme possible version of Parfit's thought experiment. He can see what his other selves became. He can see the roads not taken made flesh, walking around and making policy decisions in a city built out of his own branching possibilities. And rather than finding this liberating, he finds it suffocating. The Citadel is a mirror Rick cannot stand to look into, not because it shows him something ugly, though some of what it shows him is ugly, but because it shows him that the choices he made were not necessary. He could have been any of those other Ricks. He happened to be this one, and happening to be this one is the only justification he has for caring about the particular life he's living. Most people don't have to confront this. Most people live as though their specific life is the only possible version of themselves, because for practical purposes it is. Rick has the multiverse to prove otherwise. And the proof, rather than consoling him, makes everything feel thinner, less substantial, more contingent, more arbitrary. This is what the Citadel is really about philosophically. It's an externalization of the thought that destroys many people from the inside, that you might have been someone else entirely, and that the self you currently are is not special, not chosen, not cosmically endorsed, just one roll of the dice among infinite rolls. Rick's answer to this, and it is worth saying plainly, is to be this specific Rick as loudly and as relentlessly as possible. He doubles down on the particular. He refuses to merge. He refuses to moderate or compromise or pool. He keeps the specific gravity of his own identity intact through sheer force of insistence. Whether this is wisdom or pride is a question the show leaves deliberately open. Summer and the philosopher's forgotten daughter. We should talk about Summer, because the show mostly doesn't, and that absence is itself a kind of argument. Summer Smith is Rick's granddaughter, 17 years old, high schooler, initially written as the most ordinary member of the family. She wants to be popular. She worries about her social standing. Her concerns in the early seasons feel deliberately mundane against the backdrop of Rick's cosmic adventures. And then, quietly, across several seasons, something changes. Summer becomes competent. She develops real capability in situations that require it. Combat, navigation, improvisation. She goes on adventures with Rick that Morty doesn't go on. She holds her own in ways that slowly stop being surprising. And Rick, who does not distribute praise generously, begins to treat her with a respect that he extends to almost no one. But the show never quite gives Summer the philosophical examination it gives Rick, or Morty, or even Beth. She stays in the background of the show's ideas while doing real work in its plot. There's something in this worth examining, because it connects to a philosophical tradition that academic philosophy spent most of its history ignoring before feminist philosophers in the 20th century pulled it into the open. The philosopher Nell Noddings, writing in the 1980s, developed what she called the ethics of care. Her argument was that Western moral philosophy had been almost entirely organized around abstract principles, rules, rights, duties, utilities, and had systematically undervalued the moral work that happens in concrete relationships, in the specific, attentive, responsive care that one particular person gives to another particular person. This care work, Noddings argued, is not a lesser form of ethics. It is ethics at its most fundamental, before abstraction strips away the specific human beings that morality is supposed to be for. Summer practices ethics of care in almost every episode she appears in. She reads what people need and responds to it. When Rick is in genuine pain and won't admit it, Summer is usually the one who notices. When Morty is in over his head, Summer often arrives before Rick does, because Summer pays attention to Morty in a way that Rick's ego doesn't always permit. The show doesn't frame this as philosophy. It frames it as a teenage girl being capable. But the capacity she's demonstrating is exactly the capacity that Noddings spent her career arguing philosophy had chronically undervalued. Rick, by contrast, is almost constitutionally incapable of care in this specific sense. He can act to protect people. He can sacrifice himself. But the attentive, responsive, noticing what another person needs before they say it mode of engagement, that's beyond him. His intelligence is vast and his attention to the people he loves is genuine, but it is intermittent, and it tends to arrive through crisis rather than through the kind of steady, ordinary presence that care requires. Summer's presence in the show is a quiet argument that the most valuable form of intelligence might not be the kind Rick has. It might be the kind that keeps track of people, that pays attention to them, that knows when to push and when to be still, and when to show up without being asked. Rick would not put it this way. Rick would say something dismissive about emotional intelligence being a cope for people who can't do real science. But Rick keeps coming home to a family that Summer helps hold together, and the holding together is why there's a home to come back to. The Problem of the Vindicators, Season 3 Episode 4, is one of the show's angriest episodes, and it's angry about something specific. The Vindicators are superheroes. They're the show's version of the Avengers, a team of extraordinary beings who band together to fight evil for the good of the galaxy. They are celebrated across the universe. They have fans, merchandise, a mythology built around their courage and their righteousness. Rick hates them. He has hated them for a long time, before the episode begins. And the episode shows us why, in the course of revealing that Rick has constructed an elaborate death trap for them, a trap that can only be disarmed by solving a series of moral puzzles that the Vindicators, with all their heroism, are catastrophically unprepared for. The heroes fail the moral tests, not because they're villains, because they're frauds. They believe in their own mythology without examining the gap between the mythology and their actual behavior. They've done heroic things, yes. They've also done terrible things they've never reckoned with, terrible things they're still doing, terrible things they've covered over with enough good publicity that no one, including themselves, looks too closely. The trap doesn't kill them for their sins. It asks them to acknowledge those sins, to look clearly at who they are, rather than who they claim to be. And they can't do it. The death trap that requires genuine self-examination is harder for them than anything a physical enemy has ever thrown at them. The philosopher Socrates made his career, and eventually his death, out of a practice he called elenchus. It is usually translated as refutation or cross-examination. What Socrates did, in the marketplaces of Athens, was find people who believed they knew something, politicians, poets, craftsmen, generals, and ask them to explain it. Not to test them, exactly, to find out whether the confidence in their knowledge was warranted. Almost invariably it wasn't. The person who thought they knew what courage was could not define it. The person who claimed to know what justice was dissolved into contradiction within 20 minutes. The confidence was there, the knowledge was not. Socrates described himself as one of the least wise people in Athens, because he at least knew that he didn't know. Everyone else thought they did. Rick is doing Socratic elenchus to the Vindicators. He is the death trap. He is the cross-examination. He has decided that the gap between who the Vindicators claim to be and who they actually are is so large that it needs to be confronted, even violently, because the universe they are supposedly protecting cannot afford to be protected by self-deceptions this severe. There's something genuinely righteous in Rick's contempt for the Vindicators, even if the death trap is not a justifiable response to the problem he's identified. He is right that genuine heroism requires self-knowledge. He is right that people who believe their own mythology without scrutinizing it are dangerous precisely because their power isn't matched by their honesty. He is right that the moral grandeur of the Vindicators' public image covers over behavior that their fans would find indefensible. But Rick has his own mythology, his own gap between self-image and reality. He is not immune to the Socratic critique he's applying to everyone else. He thinks he knows exactly what he is: a genius, a cynic, a man without illusions. And in the same way that the Vindicators' confidence in their own heroism was their vulnerability, Rick's confidence in his own clear-eyedness is his. He has built a self-image around being the person who sees through everyone else's self-image. And that self-image is itself a construction, itself maintained by selective attention, itself in need of the examination he insists everyone else undergo. The episode doesn't make this point explicitly, but the Morty drunk Rick of that episode, the version of Rick who constructed the whole scenario while blackout drunk and genuinely doesn't remember doing it, is the show's way of suggesting that Rick's cruelest insights about other people sometimes come from the part of himself he hasn't looked at yet. Evil Morty and the Limit of Cynicism. There is an episode in Season 3, and then a resolution, years later in Season 5, that is built around a version of Morty who is not our Morty, Evil Morty. He is introduced as a mystery and resolved as an argument. A Morty who learned the lessons Rick teaches, that the universe is indifferent, that meaning is constructed, that power is the only honest currency in an honest reckoning with reality, and then applied those lessons without flinching. He did what Rick never quite does. He completed the philosophy. Evil Morty's goal, revealed in the Season 5 finale, is to escape what he calls the central finite curve. The central finite curve is the portion of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest person in the room, an infinite but bounded region that Rick's portal gun technology has always been constrained to, apparently because Rick, at some level, consciously or not, engineered it that way. Every dimension Rick can visit is a dimension where Rick is superior. He has, without acknowledging it, curated his own experience of infinite universes to always confirm his own dominance. Evil Morty sees this. He identifies the mechanism. He spends years planning to break through it, to reach the parts of the multiverse where Ricks are ordinary, where a Morty can be the smartest person in the room, where the dynamic that has defined and exploited every Morty who ever existed simply does not apply. He succeeds. He escapes. He leaves, and the show lets him leave, and the camera holds on the open yellow portal he passes through, and it is genuinely one of the most striking moments the series has produced, because it is the most complete enactment of a philosophical position the show has ever shown. Evil Morty is the active nihilist that Rick never quite became. He identified a structure that was causing suffering. He refused to accept it. He built a plan to destroy it. He executed the plan. And then he left, not into some promised paradise, but into genuine open uncertainty, into the parts of the multiverse that nobody has mapped, into a freedom that is real precisely because it comes without guarantees. The philosopher Albert Camus, whom we've mentioned before, wrote that the only honest response to the absurd is rebellion, not despair. Despair accepts the verdict of meaninglessness and collapses under it, and not hope. Hope in the religious sense is just another form of flight, projecting meaning onto a universe that doesn't have any. Rebellion is the third option, the refusal to pretend the absurd away, combined with the insistence on living anyway, on full terms without flinching. Evil Morty rebels. He refuses to live inside a system designed to keep him small. He doesn't rage against it, doesn't despair in it, doesn't seek comfort through false meaning. He just looks at the structure clearly, sees what it requires of him, decides he won't pay that price, and leaves. This is the most complete philosophical act in the entire show, and it belongs to the villain. The show doesn't endorse Evil Morty's methods. He causes serious harm on his way out. But the idea he's executing, that recognizing an oppressive structure is the first step, and refusing to keep participating in it is the second, is not itself villainous. The harm comes from how he gets there, not from the destination. Our Rick, watching the yellow portal close, has no response. For once, the smartest person in the room has nothing to say, because evil Morty just did something Rick has known he could do for decades and never done. He left. He chose himself. He built something new rather than continuing to inhabit something old. Rick chose the family instead. Every time, even when he'd never say it that way, he chose the specific messy, imperfect gravity of these specific people. Evil Morty chose freedom. Our Rick chose home. Both are coherent choices. The show presents them both without blinking, and then lets the audience sit with the question of which one it would make. Rick against the utilitarian. Let's spend some time with a specific kind of moral pressure the show puts on Rick, because it comes up in different forms across multiple episodes and it's philosophically precise in ways that reward attention. Utilitarianism is the moral theory, most associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, that says the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. It is in many ways the most intuitive moral framework we have. When you have to make a hard choice, you do the math. Whose welfare is served? Whose is harmed? How many? How much? And you do the thing that produces the best outcome across the total. Simple, rigorous, seemingly unanswerable. Rick is capable of utilitarian calculation. He can run the math faster than any human philosopher. He can see in real time the downstream consequences of a given choice across probability trees of enormous complexity. If there were ever a person qualified to act as a utilitarian, it would be Rick. And he consistently, at the moments that matter most, refuses to. There's a version of the trolley problem, the classic utilitarian thought experiment about pulling a lever to divert a trolley away from 5 people and toward one, that shows up in Rick's life constantly. Not with trolleys, but with the same basic structure. A large number of strangers on one side, a small number of specific people Rick knows on the other. The utilitarian calculation is clear in every case. You save the strangers. More lives preserved is better than fewer. Rick almost never saves the strangers. In the Ricklantes mix-up, and across the Citadel storylines, Rick watches entire civilizations of Ricks and Mortys engage in systemic oppression of each other, and does essentially nothing about it at a macro scale. He has the power to intervene. The math of suffering is not ambiguous. He doesn't intervene because the Citadel is not his family, and what is not his family is in Rick's operative moral universe, not his primary concern. The philosopher Bernard Williams wrote a critique of utilitarianism that has become one of the most discussed arguments in contemporary ethics. Williams argued that utilitarianism, taken seriously, requires a person to sever their connection to their own projects, their own commitments, their own particular relationships, in favor of whatever the impersonal calculus demands. And severing those connections doesn't just make you less happy, it makes you less of a person. Your integrity, the coherent set of commitments that makes you who you are, is destroyed by the demand that you always set it aside for the aggregate. Williams called this the alienation problem. Utilitarianism alienates you from your own life. It turns you into a function, a welfare maximization machine, rather than a person with a character. Rick's refusal to be a welfare maximization machine is through Williams' lens, an insistence on maintaining his own integrity. He is not indifferent to suffering. He has saved entire planets. He has intervened in situations where intervention cost him enormously. But he draws a circle, and the circle is not drawn by utilitarian calculation. It is drawn by love, by the particular, non-transferable commitments that make Rick Rick rather than a generic agent for good outcomes. This is not admirable in every instance. People die because Rick draws the circle where he draws it, and the utilitarian criticism of that is real and deserves to be felt. But Williams would say, and the show without using his language seems to agree, that a Rick who ran the utilitarian calculation in every situation and always acted on it would not be a better person. He would be a worse one. Emptier, less trustworthy in the specific way that matters. He would be the kind of person whose love is always provisional, always subject to revision if the numbers change. Morty, Beth, Summer, even Jerry in his way, they trust Rick not because Rick always does the most good. They trust Rick because they know where the circle is drawn. They are inside it. And inside the circle, Rick is as close to unconditionally reliable as his character allows. That reliability is worth something. It is worth more than the strangers saved by a Rick who didn't draw circles. The garage as monastery. We've spent a lot of time in the multiverse. Let's come back to the house. Rick's garage is where the show spends a lot of its quiet moments. It is where Rick builds things, drinks things, mutters to himself. It is where Morty often finds him when something needs to start or end. It is in the architecture of the Smith family home, the space that belongs entirely to Rick, not claimed for family functions, not shared, not decorated by Beth or overrun by Jerry. Just Rick's workbench, and Rick's inventions, and Rick's mess. A monastery is a place set apart. It is a space where the ordinary rules of the social world are suspended, where a particular kind of attention can be practiced, where the inhabitant can be with themselves in a way that the outside world doesn't permit. Monasteries are associated with religion, obviously, but the idea of a dedicated space for a particular mode of being is much older and broader than any specific tradition. Rick's garage is his monastery. Not in any spiritual sense. Rick would find the comparison offensive, but in the sense of a place where one person's particular kind of attention is practiced without interference. Rick doesn't build things in the garage because the garage is convenient. He builds things there because the garage is the place where he can be alone with what he knows, where the performing of being Rick for his family is temporarily suspended, where whatever is underneath the performance has room to exist. The philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote, in the 17th century, that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room. He meant that restlessness is not incidental to the human condition, it is constitutive of it. We move, distract, busy ourselves, because stillness confronts us with things we'd rather not confront. The person who can be still, genuinely still, without reaching for their phone or their next project or their next drink, is rare, and the stillness they practice is a discipline, not a default. Rick cannot be still. This is important to say plainly. For all his intelligence, for all the time he spends alone in the garage, Rick is not still. He is always building something, always mixing something, always working on the next invention that will make the next adventure possible. The garage looks like a place of solitude, but it functions as a place of relentless activity. The Taoist tradition, particularly the writings collected under the name of Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, has a concept called Wu Wei, which translates roughly as non-action or effortless action. It does not mean doing nothing. It means acting in alignment with the natural flow of things, without forcing, without striving, without the grinding effortfulness that comes from fighting the current. Water, Lao Tzu's favorite image, does not strain to flow downhill, it just flows. And in flowing without effort, it wears down stone. Rick is constitutionally incapable of Wu Wei. He is all force, all effort, all friction with the world. He does not align with the current. He builds a device that redirects the current. He does not accept obstacles. He invents tools that eliminate them. The universe's resistance to his will is not something Rick works with. It is something Rick defeats. This is not without its costs. A person who is always straining against things never finds the relief that comes from sometimes moving with them. Rick's relationship with reality is adversarial. He is permanently in contest with whatever the universe sets against him, permanently generating the kind of friction that produces genius but also produces exhaustion. He has been in this contest for decades. He will be in it until he isn't. And the toll of that, though he would deny it, is visible in every scene where the comedy goes quiet and the face of a very tired old man looks out of the animation for a second before the joke covers it over again. The Tao Te Ching also says that the person who knows others is wise, but the person who knows themselves is enlightened. Rick knows the multiverse. He knows physics. He knows biology, chemistry, the mechanics of consciousness, the architecture of time. He does not know himself. He has constructed a self-image and defended it with extraordinary intelligence, and he has not, in any episode the show has given us, sat quietly with the question of who he actually is underneath the construction. This is not unique to Rick. It is one of the most common human evasions, but it is particularly poignant in someone who has directed that much intelligence outward, all that capacity, and almost none of it turned inward. The garage is full of things Rick has built to understand the universe better. There is nothing in it designed to help Rick understand Rick. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote about what he called the shadow, the parts of the self that a person refuses to acknowledge, that get pushed into the unconscious and show up sideways in behavior that the person cannot explain and will not own. Jung believed that the shadow grows larger the more rigorously a person denies it. The more you insist on a particular self-image, the more the parts of yourself that don't fit that image accumulate in the dark, waiting to erupt in moments of stress or vulnerability when the defenses are down. Rick's shadow is enormous. It is everything he would not admit to: the grief, the longing, the need to be loved by the specific people in that house. the terror that they might not stay, the possibility that underneath all the genius there is just a man who misses his wife and never found a way to grieve her properly. The garage is where he keeps the shadow busy. He gives it things to build, and as long as the building continues, the shadow doesn't have to speak. This works until it doesn't, and the moments when it doesn't, when the grief or the fear or the need breaks through in ways the comedy can't quite contain, are the most honest moments the show produces. They are also the moments Rick moves away from fastest, reaching for the flask, cracking a joke, opening a portal to somewhere else. Because the shadow, when it speaks, is not speaking the language of someone who has everything figured out. It is speaking the language of someone who is still, after all these years, in the middle of something he started a long time ago and doesn't know how to finish. The ethics of what Rick remembers. There is a scene in season 4, in the episode Child Rick of Mort, where Rick is briefly content, not philosophically content, not at peace with the void, just, in the ordinary human sense, having a good time. He builds a civilization with an alien planet he accidentally impregnated. He teaches his children to hunt. He sits by a fire. He is, for a few minutes of screen time, engaged with something immediate and physical and simple, and the engagement is visibly good for him. The comedy undercuts it, as the show always does. But the moment before the undercutting is real, and it points towards something that a philosopher named Aristotle noticed a very long time ago. Aristotle believed that the good life, eudaimonia, which we've discussed before in the context of Homer Simpson, was not a state but an activity. You don't achieve flourishing and then have it. You flourish by doing certain things, consistently, over time. And among the things required for flourishing, Aristotle listed not just the virtues, courage, honesty, generosity, but also practical engagement with the world. The person who only thinks and never makes, who only reasons and never acts, is not fully flourishing. Human beings are, for Aristotle, embodied creatures who need to do things with their bodies in the world, not just think things inside their heads. Rick building a civilization on an alien planet with his bare hands, inventing tools, teaching skills, solving practical problems that require physical as well as intellectual work. Is Rick flourishing? In Aristotle's sense, he is doing rather than only knowing. He is engaged rather than only observing. The activity pulls him out of his own head and into the world, and the world, encountered directly and physically, is less terrible than it is when encountered through pure thought. This is part of what the adventures do for Rick that pure contemplation cannot. They require him to be present in his body, responding to things that are happening now, using intelligence in the service of specific immediate tasks, rather than running it over the background horror of existence. Aristotle would recognize this as healthy. The philosophy Rick performs in monologue, the everything is meaningless, nothing matters, I don't care framework, is contradicted by the fact that he clearly finds the doing of things more bearable than the not doing. Activity is not the same as meaning. Rick knows this. He knows that the civilization he's building on that planet will not make the universe more meaningful, but it is more bearable, in this moment, than the alternative. And maybe that's what most of what we call meaning actually is. Not some cosmic endorsement of our choices, but just the experience of being caught up in something, of having somewhere to put the attention, of being for a few hours less aware of the void, because there is something more immediate than the void occupying the mind. Rick's tragedy is that he knows this too. He knows that the activity is a distraction from the thought, and that knowing it makes the distraction less effective. He cannot quite lose himself in things the way a person who hasn't thought this hard can lose themselves. The meta-awareness is always there, but the distraction still works, partially, enough to get through the day, enough to keep the flask at arm's length for a few hours at a stretch. That partial working is what the show keeps documenting. And there's something important in it that gets lost when people describe Rick as purely broken, purely suffering, purely a cautionary tale. He is still here. Every episode, Rick Sanchez is still here. That continuity, that persistence, that refusal to stop despite everything he knows. It is not nothing, it is in fact the thing. The question the show keeps not answering. We are getting close to the end of tonight. The ideas are slowing down, as ideas do in the late hours. Let them settle. There is a question underneath every section of what we've talked about, a question that the show circles without landing on, the same way a moth circles a light without quite touching it. Can a person who knows too much still be happy? The show has answered this in every direction, and committed to none of them. There are episodes where Rick is, briefly, something like content, There are episodes where the despair is close enough to the surface that the comedy barely covers it. There are episodes where Rick seems to have found, in Morty's company or in Beth's gaze or in the momentum of a particularly good adventure, something that functions like joy, not examined, not named, but real in the way that only unexamined things are fully real. The philosopher William James, pragmatist, brother of the novelist Henry James, argued that beliefs should be judged by their consequences. A belief that helps you live better is, for James, a better belief than one that doesn't, regardless of whether it is more strictly true. The truth of a belief and its usefulness are not the same thing, and James was explicit that usefulness is not a trivial criterion. If believing that your life has meaning makes you function better, connect better, contribute more, suffer less, then that belief has a genuine claim on your acceptance, even if you cannot prove it from first principles. Rick refuses this. He will not believe that his life has meaning just because the belief would be useful. His intelligence is, in this sense, a moral commitment. He will not console himself with something he knows to be constructed. He demands the unvarnished version even when the unvarnished version is painful. He is a pragmatist's nightmare, a person for whom the truth is more important than the consequences of believing it. But James would notice something. Rick does believe things that function as meaning, even if he won't call them that. He believes that Morty matters. He believes that the specific history he shares with Beth is worth preserving. He believes, in action if not in words, that this particular garage and this particular family and this particular Thursday morning deserve his continued presence. These beliefs function exactly as the pragmatist's meaningful beliefs function. They make him get up, keep going, come home. He just won't admit they're beliefs. He performs certainty that they're illusions while acting as though they're not. That gap, again, the thing Rick knows and the way Rick acts. The show lives in that gap, and so does the most interesting philosophy about what it means to be a conscious thing in an unconscious universe. You don't have to resolve it tonight. Rick hasn't resolved it in 30 years of trying. You can let it sit in the dark with you, unanswered, held loosely, turning slowly. The ideas that don't resolve are often the ones worth keeping. They stay with you. They change shape as you change. The question of whether knowing too much is compatible with happiness is not the kind of question that gives you an answer and leaves. It's the kind that walks alongside you for years, asking itself again at different moments in your life, arriving with slightly different emphasis each time. At 20, it sounds like a question about intelligence. At 40, it sounds like a question about what you wish you didn't know. At 60, it sounds like a question about whether the knowing was worth it. Rick is asking it at 70, in a garage, with a drink he shouldn't be having, surrounded by people he loves and can't quite tell that he loves. And he keeps asking, and he keeps staying. That's the whole thing, really. That's the philosophy. Not the answers. There aren't any, and Rick would be the first to tell you that. The asking continued. The staying, chosen again every morning. The portal gun on the workbench, pointed at possibility, not quite pointed at escape. Jerry and the dignity of ordinary wanting. We have talked about Rick. We have talked about Morty and Beth and Summer. We have circled the family from every angle except one. Jerry Smith is Rick's son-in-law. He is, by most metrics the show applies, a failure. He loses jobs with consistency. He lacks confidence in almost every social situation. His ambitions are modest and even those he usually cannot reach. Rick calls him a moron, with a frequency that eventually stops feeling like insult and starts feeling like weather. Just a thing that happens, something the Smiths live with. The show treats Jerry as comic relief, mostly. He is there to be humiliated, to be the butt, to remind us by contrast how little competence looks like so that Rick's competence can read larger. He is a measuring stick for inadequacy. But spend some time with Jerry when the comedy isn't pushing you away from him. Jerry wants simple things. He wants his wife to respect him. He wants his children to be proud of him. He wants to have been good at something, to have done something the people in his life can point to and say, yes, that was Jerry, he did that. These are not extraordinary desires. They are the desires of most people who have ever lived, stated without inflation, without disguise. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who spent most of her career thinking about the conditions of political life, made a distinction that is useful here. She wrote about what she called the vita activa, the active life, and she divided it into 3 kinds of activity. Labor, which is the biological maintenance of life. Eating, sleeping, producing what gets consumed. Work, which is the fabrication of durable things that outlast the individual who makes them. and action, which is the entry into the public world among other people, the revelation of who you are through what you do in the presence of others. Arendt thought that action was the highest form of activity because it is where genuine individuality becomes visible. When you act in the public world, you are not just maintaining yourself or making objects. You are showing up as a specific person who could not have been predicted from the conditions that produced you. Action, for Arendt, is always surprising. It exceeds its causes. Rick's life is almost pure action in Arendt's sense. Taken to a cosmic extreme, he acts, he surprises, he exceeds every prediction, but the scale of Rick's action has become so large that it has lost the quality Arendt most valued in it, the fact that action requires an audience of equals. You reveal who you are to other people, people who can recognize and remember and respond. Rick's actions exceed anything his audience can follow. He performs his individuality in a register no one around him can fully read. Jerry, by contrast, is the opposite failure. His actions are small enough that even his family cannot see them as meaningful. He acts and no one notices. He reveals himself and the revelation doesn't land. This is the comedy. But underneath it is a genuine philosophical question about what gives ordinary wanting its dignity, or whether it has any. Arendt would say it does. She was deeply suspicious of the idea that significance is a function of scale. Small actions consistently performed among people who actually know you. She thought these were the substrate of political and social life. The person who shows up, who participates, who acts in the ordinary sense of engaging with others rather than retreating into private desire, is doing something real. Jerry wants to be seen. That is not a small thing dressed up as a small thing. That is the fundamental human desire that all of Rick's genius is actually failing to satisfy in himself. While he mocks it in Jerry, Rick has the audience wrong. He has been performing for the multiverse, for other Ricks, for entities of vast intelligence, and none of them give him what Jerry is actually looking for in that house with those people. Ordinary recognition, from specific people who choose to give it. Jerry gets it from Beth, inconsistently in ways that don't always hold. But the wanting is not shameful. The wanting is correct. Jerry is, in this one way that the show rarely credits him for, pointing at the right thing. What makes Jerry philosophically interesting, not as a fool but as a figure, is that he has not constructed an elaborate system to protect himself from what he wants. He wants recognition, and he says he wants it, through every embarrassing attempt to get it. Rick wants the same thing, badly, and has built the most sophisticated evasion in the multiverse, to avoid admitting it. Jerry's transparency is, by this reading, its own kind of integrity. He cannot maintain the performance. The wanting shows through, and things that show through, for all the embarrassment they cause, are closer to the truth than things that are successfully hidden. The invention Rick won't build. There's a question the show sets up by accident, in the background of almost everything Rick does, and never directly asks. Rick has invented a device that can do nearly anything. He has solved faster-than-light travel, biological engineering, artificial consciousness, time manipulation. He has technologies that would, if distributed, change the material condition of every living being in every dimension he visits. Poverty, disease, death. All of it is solvable with the tools Rick already has. He does not distribute them. This is not a plot point the show dwells on. It is just true, in the way that background facts are true, present in every episode without ever being named. Rick sits on an incomprehensible trove of solutions and does not apply them at scale. The family has to deal with Jerry's unemployment. Earth continues having wars. The galactic economy continues being organized around exploitation. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps and wrote, afterward, a book called Man's Search for Meaning. His central argument was that human beings can endure almost anything if they have a why, a reason for the suffering, a purpose that orients them. Without purpose, people break. With it, even the worst conditions can be survived. Frankl called the search for meaning the primary motivational force in human beings, prior to pleasure or power. Frankl also argued that meaning cannot be given. It cannot be handed to someone else fully formed. A person has to find it in the specific texture of their specific life, in the work they do, in the love they give, in the suffering they choose to endure rather than escape. You cannot free someone from their search for meaning by doing their searching for them. The meaning must be earned, from inside. This is the only coherent explanation for Rick's restraint that doesn't make him simply selfish. If Rick hands Morty a device that solves every problem Morty will ever face, he does not give Morty a good life. He gives Morty an empty one. He removes the conditions under which Morty can become anyone. Struggle is not the goal. Suffering is not inherently ennobling, but the effort of working through something, the particular shape a person develops in the act of pushing against resistance, is not reproducible by shortcut. The person who built the thing and the person who had the thing handed to them are not equivalent. Rick knows this. He knows it in the way that someone who grew up building things from nothing knows it, not as a philosophical position but as a felt fact, something in the body that precedes the articulation. He doesn't hand Morty solutions. He takes Morty to the problems. He makes Morty stand in the situation and figure something out, badly, imperfectly, with Rick there as backup but not as substitute. This is not obvious love. It looks like cruelty sometimes, especially when Morty fails and the consequences are real. But Frankl would recognize it. Rick is protecting the conditions under which Morty can find something that cannot be given. Whether Rick does this consciously, whether he could say this if asked, the flask would probably come out before the sentence finished. But the pattern is there, episode after episode. Rick does not solve things for Morty that Morty can solve. He saves Morty from death. He does not save him from growing up. Beth's surgery and the problem of excellence. Beth Smith is a horse surgeon. The show gives this fact a specific weight. Not a human surgeon, a horse surgeon. She chose a specialty that is by most social measures less prestigious than working on people. She is also, it becomes clear across multiple episodes, very good at what she does. She has not settled. She has chosen something specific, and she has mastered it. Aristotle wrote about something he called megalopsychos, usually translated as the great-souled person. The term gets misread as arrogance, because Aristotle says the great-souled person thinks well of themselves and is right to do so. But what Aristotle means is more careful. The megalopsychos knows their own worth accurately. They are not puffed up with false confidence, and they do not downplay themselves to seem modest. They have achieved something real, and they carry that achievement without either shame or inflation. Beth is trying to be megalopsychos about horse surgery. She has done the thing, she has trained, practiced, achieved genuine skill, and she is trying to believe that this is enough. That excellence in the thing you chose is real excellence, regardless of whether the thing impressed anyone. Rick's presence makes this harder, because Rick is the most extreme version of the opposite problem, someone whose worth is so vast that acknowledging it fully would be unbearable. Rick is not megalopsychos. He performs contempt for almost everything, including himself, because the alternative, accurate self-assessment for a man who knows everything and has done everything and is still profoundly unhappy, might be too much to hold. The episode Pickle Rick is, among other things, a therapy session about this exact dynamic. A family therapist named Dr. Wong delivers, without fanfare, one of the most philosophically precise speeches in the series. She tells Rick that he turned himself into a pickle to avoid therapy, that the intelligence he uses to escape every problem is being used to escape the only problem he can't solve with intelligence. She is not impressed by the pickle. She has seen this before. Aristotle would recognize the problem Dr. Wong names. The virtues require habituated practice. You don't become courageous by thinking about courage. You become courageous by doing the specific actions that courage requires, repeatedly, until they become second nature. Rick has practiced intelligence so long that it has become the only tool he reaches for. He cannot practice vulnerability or honesty or emotional presence because he has never habituated those. He has the tool he built, and everything looks like a problem that tool can solve. Beth is trying to build different tools. The horse surgery is, in this reading, not a choice about career. It is a choice about what kind of person she is trying to become. She picked something hard enough to require her full attention, specific enough to give her days their shape, and good enough in itself to justify the time she gives it. That is the Aristotelian path to flourishing. Not the biggest achievement but the right one, practiced with full engagement. Rick will not tell her this, but in his better moments, when the performance drops for a second, you can see that he knows it. She is doing something he cannot. She is choosing a life rather than outrunning one. The microverse and the problem of creation. There is an episode called The Ricks Must Be Crazy, in which Rick reveals that he has created a universe inside his car battery, a universe with inhabited planets, civilizations, billions of conscious beings, all of whom exist so that their civilization's energy production can power Rick's car. They don't know this. From inside the microverse, there is no evidence that their existence is instrumental. Their science, their history, their philosophy, none of it gestures at the possibility that they are, from outside, a battery. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz asked, in the 17th century, why there is something rather than nothing. His answer was that God, as the most perfect possible being, would necessarily create the best possible world rather than no world at all. Creation is an act of overflowing perfection, not need. The world exists because a perfect being, by definition, cannot withhold existence from what could exist. Rick is a god in the microverse in the exact sense that Leibniz was describing, but with the theology stripped away. He created conscious beings. He sustains the conditions of their existence. He can destroy them if he wants to. The beings inside the microverse have no access to the fact of their creation or to Rick's intentions. From inside, they have all the freedom they experience themselves as having. From outside, everything they do serves a purpose they didn't choose and cannot see. This is also the structure of most religious accounts of the human situation. What the episode does with this premise is important. Rick is not portrayed as benevolent in his creation. He created the microverse because he needed a power source. He did not weigh the moral cost of consciousness against the practical benefit of the battery. He just built it. He is efficient where theology imagines love, instrumental where theology imagines care. And then, in the episode's most uncomfortable move, the scientist inside the microverse does exactly what Rick did. He creates his own sub-universe, a civilization inside the microverse, for the same reason Rick built the microverse. The beings inside the sub-universe are powering the scientist's engine, which powers the microverse, which powers Rick's car. The regress is a joke. It is also a philosophical argument about the arbitrariness of purpose. Every frame of reference has something below it being used, something above it being served, and no frame is more fundamental than any other. The microverse beings' lives are not more or less meaningful than the beings in the sub-universe. And by the logic of the argument, human lives are not more or less meaningful than the microverse beings. The frame shifts. The significance doesn't accumulate. Leibniz would say this proves the need for a ground floor, a creator who is not herself created, a purpose that is not itself instrumental. Rick would say Leibniz was doing exactly what the microverse beings do, inventing a frame above the frame to escape the discomfort of contingency. Rick is probably right about Leibniz. The discomfort of contingency is real, and the escape is invented. But Rick is also responsible for the microverse. He made conscious beings and put them in a situation of total unfreedom, without their knowledge or consent. Whatever he thinks about the philosophical foundations of meaning, the beings in his battery are suffering and striving and dying, and none of it was asked for. This is the show's most direct engagement with theodicy, the question of why suffering exists if a creator is good. Rick's answer is that creators aren't good. They're convenient. The microverse exists because Rick needed a battery. If there is a god above Rick, that god needed something too. You can sit with that in the dark. It doesn't have to resolve tonight. Most of the questions worth asking don't. Rick's body, the flask is always there. It is easy to read it as a symbol, the alcoholism as a signifier for the pain underneath the performance. That reading is not wrong, but spend some time with it as a physical fact rather than a symbol. Rick drinks constantly, he belches constantly, his body is always present, always doing something that interrupts the philosophical register the character otherwise operates in. He falls asleep in chairs, he scratches himself. He is, for all his cosmic intelligence, housed in an aging human body that does aging human body things, and the show keeps putting that in the frame. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty spent his career arguing that consciousness is not something that sits inside a body and looks out at the world. Consciousness is always already embodied. It knows the world through the body. It has a perspective because the body has a location. It moves through space because the body moves. The body is not a vehicle for the mind. The body is the form that experience takes. Rick has tried to defeat this. His portal gun is an attempt to detach from location, to be everywhere and nowhere, to move through space without the body's constraints. His intelligence is an attempt to operate from pure calculation, rather than from the situated, perspectival, emotionally textured knowing that embodied creatures have. He would prefer, if such a preference is coherent, to be a mind without a body, but the flask keeps showing up. The body knows things the mind hasn't processed. Rick's hand reaches for the drink before Rick has decided to drink. The compulsion operates below the philosophical layer, in the tissue, in the nervous system's learned response to states it wants to change. Rick is not thinking about drinking, he is drinking. The body is already in motion before the mind catches up. Merleau-Ponty called this motor intentionality, the body's own kind of directedness toward the world. Prior to conscious intention, a pianist doesn't consciously plan each finger movement. The body knows the music. Rick's body knows the drink. This is not weakness in Merleau-Ponty's terms. It is just how embodied knowledge works. The body carries its history. What Rick's body is carrying, in the specific history encoded in the habit of drinking, is not something the show has named directly, but the timing of it, the moments when the flask appears, is informative. It comes up when something is about to become real, when the emotional stakes of a scene begin to accumulate, when what Rick actually feels is approaching the surface. The drink arrives first. The body knows. The mind deflects. The flask is the hinge between the two. This is not a metaphor for Rick's pain. It is his pain, in the form that pain takes in a body that has been carrying it for decades without setting it down. If this kind of slow thinking is something you find yourself coming back to, these long nights with Rick Sanchez and the philosophers he's never read, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it means the next one finds you. New episodes land when you need them. Go at your own pace. There's no pressure and no deadline. Now close your eyes a little more. Let the next part come slowly. Bird person and what witness costs. There is a character the show introduces briefly and keeps returning to, long after his first appearance, in ways that suggest the writers understand something about what he represents. Bird person, Rick's oldest friend, a warrior from a planet Rick helped liberate in his youth. A figure who exists in the show primarily as evidence that Rick was not always who he is now, that before the cynicism calcified, there was someone capable of sustained loyalty, genuine solidarity, the kind of friendship that requires showing up for decades rather than moments. Aristotle distinguished between 3 kinds of friendship. Friendships of utility, where people are useful to each other. Friendships of pleasure, where people enjoy each other's company. And friendships of virtue, where people recognize in each other something genuinely admirable and choose, on the basis of that recognition, to build a relationship that reflects and supports the best each person is capable of. Virtue friendships, Aristotle said, are rare. They require that both people actually be virtuous, not performing virtue, not using virtue as a social strategy, but actually committed to it. And they require time. You cannot know whether a person is genuinely virtuous from a single encounter. It takes years of watching someone make choices under pressure before you can say with confidence that the character you see is the character they have. Rick and Bird Person have that time. The flashbacks and references that accumulate across the show suggest a relationship forged in genuine difficulty, in a revolution, in loss, in the specific kind of intimacy that develops when you have fought alongside someone and both survived. They have seen each other at their worst and their most desperate. They have made decisions together that neither of them would want examined too closely. The friendship carries all of that without breaking, which is what virtue friendship is for. It is load-bearing. It holds the weight that lighter relationships can't carry. Bird Person is not naive about Rick. He knows what Rick is. He has watched Rick make choices that cost other people more than they cost Rick. He has seen the intelligence used as a weapon as often as a tool. When he says, in the episode where Morty wants to know what Rick's catchphrase means, that Rick has often said that even in the darkest times, there is something worth fighting for, he is not misreading Rick. He is describing a Rick that existed long enough to become the Rick Morty has access to. The prior self, the one that could say such a thing without irony. The witness that Bird Person carries is philosophically specific. He holds the memory of who Rick was before Rick stopped believing in the person he was. He is the external archive of a self that Rick has worked hard to make inaccessible. This is what long friendships do that nothing else can. They preserve versions of you that you have discarded. The friend who knew you at 20 knows something about you that you may have deliberately forgotten, that your current self-narrative has edited out. The presence of that friend is sometimes uncomfortable not because they are wrong about you, but because they are right about something you preferred to believe you had outgrown. Bird Person's death, and subsequent resurrection as a weapon against Rick, is the show's cruelest plot move because of what it takes away. It doesn't just kill a character the audience has come to care about, it destroys the one witness. Rick loses the person who was keeping the prior version of him alive in memory. After Bird Person, there is no one left who knew Rick before. The evidence of that earlier self exists only in Rick's own memory, and Rick is the least reliable narrator of his own history. Aristotle thought virtue friendships made people better over time. The friend, by recognizing and reflecting the best version of who you are, creates an external reference point for the self that helps you stay oriented toward it. You become, slowly, the person your virtue friend sees. When the mirror breaks, you lose not just the reflection but the orientation. You can still choose to be the person your friend believed you were, but you have to do it without the confirmation. You have to hold the prior self in memory, alone, without anyone who can tell you whether you are still him. Rick, after Bird Person, has no virtue friend. He has family, which is a different kind of bond, chosen and unchosen at once, full of obligation and resentment and love that doesn't have the purity of chosen friendship. He has Morty, who is too young and too inside the dynamic to play the role Bird Person played. The loneliness the show is most honest about is this one, not the cosmic loneliness of knowing too much, but the ordinary specific loneliness of a person who has outlasted the people who knew them best. It is a loneliness that the portal gun cannot address. There is no universe where Bird Person is still alive and still the person he was, and still Rick's friend. That specific configuration is gone. What was lost is not retrievable, not in any dimension, because what was lost is not a person but a relationship, a specific history between two specific people that does not exist anywhere in the multiverse except as memory. Rick carries it, the way he carries everything he has lost, loudly pretending not to carry it, while carrying it everywhere he goes. Time and what Rick can't outrun. Rick has a time machine. Several, probably. He has been inside time loops, has visited past and future versions of his own life, has interacted with alternate timelines so thoroughly that the standard way of thinking about before and after has ceased to apply to him in any ordinary sense. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th century, made an observation about time that philosophers have been arguing about ever since. He said that the past doesn't exist, it is gone, unreachable, not present anywhere. The future doesn't exist either, it hasn't arrived. Only the present exists. But the present, he noticed, has no duration. The moment you identify it, it is already past. So he proposed that what we call time is actually 3 present experiences. The present of past things, which is memory, the present of present things, which is attention, and the present of future things, which is expectation. Time, for Augustine, is not a line. It is the mind itself, stretched across its own experience. Rick has the technology to violate this phenomenology completely. He can go back. He can change things. He can retrieve moments that should be gone. He should be free of the condition Augustine was describing, the way that the past persists only in memory, never in fact. But the show keeps suggesting that he isn't. The things that haunt Rick, the wife he lost, the early life he doesn't discuss, the version of himself that chose family over power, are not made less haunting by the portal gun. He can visit the past without being able to change the fact that it happened. He can see how things were without being able to return to being the person who didn't know how they would go. Memory is not just storage. This is the thing Augustine grasped and modern neuroscience has confirmed. When you remember something, you are not retrieving a fixed file. You are reconstructing it, partly from stored fragments and partly from who you are now. Every act of remembering changes the memory slightly. The past you carry is not the past that occurred. It is the past filtered through every version of yourself that has existed since. Rick's past, for all his technology, is subject to this. The wife he remembers is the wife constructed by every year of loss since her death. The young Rick who chose family is reconstructed through the lens of the old Rick, who has spent decades becoming someone who publicly claims he would not make the same choice. The memory is doing the philosophical work, not the events. Augustine would say Rick's problem is not that he can't change the past. It is that he can't stop it from changing him, which it does, continuously, in the act of remembering it. Every time Rick accesses what he has lost, he is not retrieving an archived file. He is performing an act of self-construction that shapes who he will be next. The grief is not static. It grows in him the way things grow in the mind that returns to them. The portal gun cannot solve this. No technology can. This is the one thing Rick is stuck with on exactly the same terms as everyone else who has ever loved someone and lost them. He handles it the same way most people do. He doesn't, as much as possible. He keeps moving, he opens another portal, he invents something, he makes Morty need him. Augustine would say this is the human condition taken at speed. We are all running from the present of past things, the memory that accumulates behind us like weather. Rick is just running faster than most people can. He hasn't outrun it. You can tell by the flask. So let that be where we leave things tonight. Not with a conclusion, because the questions don't conclude. Not with resolution, because Rick hasn't resolved anything and neither have you and neither has anyone, just with the garage, quiet now. The portal gun on the workbench, not pointed at anything. The flask at rest. The house full of people who are sleeping. Tomorrow the adventures will resume. Tomorrow the multiverse will need something from Rick Sanchez, and he will give it, grudgingly, brilliantly, while claiming not to care. But tonight he is just a person in a room, and you are just a person in a room. The philosophers we've moved through tonight, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Heidegger and Kierkegaard, Arendt and Camus, Aristotle and Wittgenstein, Augustine and Buber, Gramsci and Dewey, Frankl and Frankfurt and Merleau-Ponty, they were all, at some point, also just people in rooms, writing by lamplight, turning over the same questions that Rick turns over in the garage, reaching the same partial answers, and having to live in the partialness of them because the complete answers were not available. The ethics of a broken promise. Rick has made promises. The show doesn't dwell on this, but the evidence accumulates. He promised, in one form or another, to keep Morty safe. He has broken this promise with a regularity that makes the promise look hollow, and yet it seems to operate in him as something more than a policy, as an actual commitment, the kind that produces guilt rather than just recalculation when it fails. Rick does not respond to Morty's suffering with a cost-benefit analysis. He responds with something that looks, from the outside, like the specific distress of someone who promised better and didn't deliver it. Promises are philosophically strange. The philosopher David Hume pointed out that there is no natural fact in the world that corresponds to a promise. Rocks fall, animals hunt. Humans do not, by their nature, keep promises. The promise is a convention, a social institution built on the expectation of reciprocal behavior, held in place by nothing more solid than the shared commitment to acting as if it were held in place by something solid. The promise binds only in the sense that both parties agree to be bound, and the social world enforces that agreement through reputation, trust, and consequence. Rick finds most social conventions hollow. He dismisses laws, ignores governments, treats the moral frameworks most people use to organize their behavior as the arbitrary output of evolutionary pressures rather than as genuine normative constraints. By the logic of Rick's stated worldview, promises should mean nothing. A promise is just words that generate expectations, and the expectations are just neural patterns in other brains, and there is no cosmic enforcer standing behind the words. But Rick keeps his promises, when he keeps them, in a way that suggests he doesn't actually believe his stated worldview in this domain. He acts as though he is actually bound, not by fear of consequence, but by something closer to what Kant called duty. Not the outcomes, not the calculation, the commitment itself, as a fact about who he is and what that means. Kant's moral philosophy rests on the claim that rational beings are capable of binding themselves through reason. That when you make a genuine commitment, you are not just generating a prediction about your future behavior. You are changing the normative structure of your situation. You have a reason to keep the promise that exists independently of whether keeping it is convenient or whether anyone will know if you break it. The reason is the promise, and the promise is yours. Rick cannot commit to this philosophy openly. It would require acknowledging that he is bound by something, that the universe has structures that impose real obligations on him, that the nihilism is not complete. So he keeps his promises while denying that promises bind him. He acts as though Morty's safety matters while claiming loudly that nothing matters. The philosopher who most understood this gap between stated ethics and practiced ethics was probably the one Rick most resembles in temperament, David Hume himself, who dismantled the philosophical foundations of morality with one hand and behaved, by all accounts, with consistent generosity and warmth with the other. Hume was known to his friends as the most amiable man they had met. He was also the man who argued most rigorously that there was no rational basis for morality at all. Hume's answer was that reason is not the source of moral behavior. Sentiment is, we behave well when we do, because we feel the pull of other people's situations, because something in us responds to suffering with the desire to alleviate it, to care with the desire to honor it, to need with the desire to provide. This is not reducible to reason, and it is not overridden by reason. It runs alongside reason, in a different register, and when they conflict, the sentiment often wins. Rick's sentiment wins constantly. He just argues with it the whole time. What the silence holds. There is a late-night quality to the best episodes of Rick and Morty that is worth naming before we close. Not late night in the sense of crude or irreverent, though the show is both of those. Late night in the sense that the show seems to know it is being watched by people in a specific state, tired, defenses low, the careful management of the daytime self temporarily suspended. It knows that at this hour questions land differently, that the comedy can open a door that argument couldn't, that the audience sitting with Rick in the garage at midnight is a different audience than the one that would encounter these ideas in a classroom or a book. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, whom we visited briefly in the section on Rick's garage, also wrote something that is worth sitting with at this hour specifically. He wrote that the heart has its reasons which reason does not know. He was writing about faith, but the observation reaches further than theology. There is a mode of knowing that operates below the discursive, below the level of argument and counter-argument and philosophical framework that is available when the analytical machinery quiets down. The heart's reasons are not irrational. They are differently rational. They work through resonance rather than inference, through recognition rather than proof. The philosophical content of Rick and Morty is not, ultimately, what makes it land. The Schopenhauer and the Nietzsche and the Heidegger are real. The writers know their philosophy, but what makes the show's best moments stick is not the accuracy of the philosophical framing, it is the resonance. The moment when Rick's face does something in the animation and something in you responds before you have time to think about why. The moment when Morty says something true about what it feels like to know that nothing lasts, and you recognize the feeling before you recognize the words. This is the heart's reasons at work. This is why the show lands at midnight under a blanket in a way that philosophy lectures don't. The defenses that protect you from being moved by ideas you encounter in daylight are not fully in place. The resonance can get through. What the silence holds, in the late night watching and in the late night thinking, is access to the part of yourself that doesn't need to be right about things. That can hold the contradiction of knowing something doesn't matter while acting as though it does. That can love specific people with a ferocity that defeats all rational justification. That can stay in a garage in a universe that has no opinion about whether you should, because the people in the house upstairs are there, and you are here, and for tonight that's the whole of it. Rick knows this. He has always known it. He just can't say it without the belch, without the deflection, without the flask arriving first. But the knowing is there, in the staying, in the adventures that are really just reasons to come home, in the portal gun pointed at possibility but always, at the end of the episode, pointing back. That's the philosophy, the one underneath all the other philosophy, the one that doesn't have a name and doesn't need one. The child who watches. Morty has changed. This is easy to miss because the show's episodic structure encourages you to think of him as static, the constant against which Rick's genius measures itself, the 14-year-old who stays 14, but across enough episodes, a shape emerges. He has been changed by what he has seen, not broken by it. The show could have gone that way and didn't, but altered, in the specific way that people are altered by having been through things rather than around them. The philosopher John Dewey, writing in the early 20th century, argued that education is not the transmission of information from the knowledgeable to the ignorant. It is the development of the capacity to think, to encounter novel problems without templates, to reconstruct understanding from the material the situation provides, to emerge from difficulty with a more supple relationship to difficulty in general. Learning is not what you add, it is what you become in the process of working through. Morty has had Dewey's education. He was not taught chemistry or history. He was put in situations that required him to be more than he was, and then left to figure out what more looked like. Rick is a terrible teacher in every conventional sense and an extraordinary one in Dewey's sense. He does not explain. He drops Morty into the deep end and watches to see what Morty discovers about himself. What Morty discovers is not confidence, at least not the simple kind. He discovers something more like competence, the specific knowledge that he can survive things, that his previous experiences of surviving difficult things are evidence that he will survive the next one. This is not optimism, it has earned pragmatism. He has a record. The record holds. The Morty of the later seasons is quieter about his fear, not because he is less afraid. The situations are often more terrifying, but because the fear has been metabolized into something else. He knows what to do with fear now in a way that the Morty of the first episode did not. Fear is information. It tells you the stakes are real. Morty has learned to read it as such, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Rick built this, not by protecting Morty from difficulty, but by consistently returning him to it in conditions just difficult enough to require growth. The cruelty and the education are inseparable, which is the most uncomfortable thing the show asks you to hold about Rick. There is a specific scene, brief, easy to miss, in one of the later seasons where Morty solves something on his own, correctly, without Rick. And Rick, who is nearby, sees it happen and says nothing. He just watches, and his face does something that the animation mostly keeps ambiguous, but which reads, in that moment, as unmistakably close to pride. Rick would deny this instantly if you named it. He would produce a technical critique of Morty's solution. He would claim he wasn't watching, but he was watching. He has always been watching. This is what the show keeps returning to, in the gaps between the cosmic horror and the bathroom jokes. A very old man watching a very young one become someone, and caring about who that someone turns out to be with a ferocity that he will never put into words, in a garage, at the edge of infinite universes, with a flask half full of whatever gets him through the night. This content takes time to find. If you're the kind of person who wants more of it, slow thinking about the things that don't resolve, subscribing is free, and it's the only way these videos reach you when they arrive. Hit subscribe whenever you're ready, no obligation. And if you're still awake, that's fine. Let the next part settle in. What the Citadel was really building. The Citadel of Rick's is one of the show's most structurally ambitious inventions, and the Season 3 episode set entirely there, the Ricklantis mix-up, is the closest the show has come to sustained political philosophy. What the Citadel is, stripped to its frame, is a class society built entirely out of one person. Every member of the ruling class is Rick. Every member of the laboring class is Morty. The exploitation runs on a single axis, intelligence. The Ricks, who have it in abundance, have organized a civilization that extracts the labor of the Mortys, who have it in lesser quantities, and who are told, by the Ricks, by the ideology the Ricks have constructed, that this arrangement is natural, deserved, the way things are and have to be. The Mortys who believe this are called normal Mortys. The Morty who doesn't is the one who runs for president of the Citadel and wins. The political philosopher Antonio Gramsci, writing from a fascist prison in the 1930s, developed a concept he called hegemony. He meant something specific by it, not the domination of one group by another through force, though force is always available as a backup. Hegemony is the domination of one group by another through the dominated group's consent. The subordinate class agrees to the conditions of their subordination. They adopt the values, the categories, the ways of understanding the world that make their own position seem natural and inevitable. They participate in their own exploitation, not because they are stupid, but because the ideology of the ruling class has become the water they swim in. It precedes their thinking. It shapes what counts as a possible thought. The Citadel runs on Gramscian hegemony. The Mortys have internalized the value hierarchy that places Rick intelligence at the top and Morty intelligence at the bottom. The Ricks don't need to police this ideology constantly. The Mortys do it themselves, by sorting each other into normal and deviant, by praising the Mortys who accept the structure and marginalizing the ones who question it. The candidate Morty who wins the election is doing something that Gramsci would recognize as counter-hegemonic. He is not arguing that the Ricks are wrong on their own terms. He is refusing their terms. He is naming the structure that makes those terms seem natural, and showing that they are not natural at all, that they are a choice, made by people who benefit from the choice, maintained by an ideology that serves the people who constructed it. This is dangerous. Gramsci spent years in prison partly because Mussolini understood that the most powerful opposition is not military. It is the development of alternative frameworks, alternative ways of understanding social reality that make the existing arrangement seem contingent rather than necessary. When the dominated class stops believing that the hierarchy is natural, the hierarchy becomes vulnerable in ways that force cannot address. The Citadel's Morty president is building exactly this, an alternative framework. He might also be a villain. The show leaves this genuinely ambiguous. His methods involve deception and manipulation. His motives are not transparent. But the critique he embodies, that a civilization built to serve the interests of one class while using the labor and bodies of another is not a civilization but an exploitation, is not wrong just because he delivers it imperfectly. Our Rick refuses to engage with the Citadel on its own terms, which is a different kind of refusal than the Morty presidents. Rick's refusal is individual. I will not participate in this structure because participating would make me one of them. It is a refusal that preserves his sense of himself without doing anything about the structure. The Morty president's refusal is collective. This structure should not exist, and I will work to dismantle it with whatever tools are available. Neither refusal is satisfying. Rick's is self-serving in the specific way that principled individualism is always self-serving. It lets you feel clean without getting your hands dirty on behalf of anyone else. The Morty presidents is terrifying because collective action to dismantle structures of oppression does not look tidy, does not come with clean hands, and does not announce itself as heroism before it reveals whether it was. The Citadel episode doesn't resolve this. It kills most of its cast in an ambiguous act that might be liberation or might be catastrophe, and then cuts to commercial. This is the show's most honest political move, refusing the ending that would let the audience feel clear about what they watched. This is the actual tradition of philosophy, not a set of answers handed down, but a practice of staying with what is hard. The tradition is alive not because anyone solved the problems, but because the problems keep finding new people who care enough to sit with them. That is the whole inheritance, not the conclusions, the willingness to keep asking. You, in whatever room you're in tonight, are part of that tradition. You've been sitting with it for the last however many minutes without calling it philosophy, just as Rick sits with it in the garage without calling it anything at all. The questions don't require the name, they just require the attention. They just require someone willing to be with them long enough to feel their weight. Whatever questions you brought with you into this night, about meaning, about the people you love, about whether the knowing is worth it, about what remains when the performance stops, you don't have to answer them tonight. You can carry them to sleep and see what they look like in the morning. The questions will still be there. They always are. That's not a bad thing. It means there's always somewhere to start. Sleep well. The loneliness that can't be fixed. There is a version of self-knowledge that the philosophical tradition treats as unambiguously good. Know thyself, carved into the temple at Delphi. Socrates building an entire ethics out of the examined life. The therapeutic tradition, in almost all its forms, treating self-knowledge as the precondition for any real change. Rick has a different relationship to this. Rick knows what he is with a clarity that most people spend their lives avoiding. He knows he is selfish in specific ways. He knows he uses intelligence as a weapon. He knows that the contempt he performs is partly authentic and partly protective, that he genuinely finds most things tedious, and that the performance of finding them tedious keeps people at a safe distance. He knows he is afraid of losing the people he loves, and that this fear drives choices he could not defend under scrutiny. He knows all of this, and he continues anyway. This is the problem that self-knowledge alone cannot solve, and it is the problem that most self-help discourse quietly ignores. Knowing what you are doing is not the same as being able to stop doing it. The habits, the patterns, the defensive structures built over decades, they don't dissolve on contact with insight. They are in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that operate before reflection can arrive. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt made a distinction between first-order desires and second-order desires. A first-order desire is a desire for something. I want to drink. A second-order desire is a desire about a desire. I want not to want to drink. Freedom, Frankfurt said, is the ability to act on your second-order desires, to be the kind of person whose will is determined by what you actually endorse upon reflection, not just by what your first-order impulses demand. Rick has very sophisticated second-order desires. He wants to be the person who doesn't need anyone. He wants to be the person for whom love is not a vulnerability. He wants the intellectual framework he has built around himself. The universe is meaningless, nothing matters, I am beyond caring, to be the truth of his experience and not just its description. But his first-order desires keep breaking through. He keeps coming home. He keeps protecting Morty. He keeps showing up for Beth in the specific way that matters rather than in the dramatic way that would let him feel heroic. Frankfurt would say Rick is not free, not because he lacks intelligence or options, but because there is a persistent gap between what he wants to want and what he actually does. The gap is where the suffering lives. The gap is also where the love lives, which is what makes it impossible to simply close. You cannot want your way to freedom from wanting. The Buddhist tradition understood this before Frankfurt gave it philosophical vocabulary. The problem is not that you want things. The problem is that you are identified with the wanting, that you take the first-order desires to be the self, and so the self is always being pulled in directions the second-order self does not endorse. Rick is identified with his first-order desires in ways that his intelligence has not been able to dissolve. He knows at the second-order level that the drinking does not help. He knows that the deflection does not protect. He knows that the performance of not caring costs him the experience of caring, which is the only thing that makes a life feel like a life, rather than a series of solved problems. He continues anyway. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure that intelligence cannot address, which is possibly the most destabilizing thing that can happen to someone who has organized their entire existence around intelligence being the answer. The garage, the flask, the unbuilt better life. They are all the same thing, seen from different angles. The distance between knowing and being. The territory that lies between understanding your condition and actually changing it. Rick is not unusual in this distance. He is just unusually aware of it.